Greetings from sunny, beautiful Porterfield Hall. It's me, Ratcliffe, and today I want to talk some about art history. We're starting our section on art history, so that starts with chapter 15. And if you haven't read chapter 15, read it, and that will help with lots of things like the test. And if you read that chapter before we talk about it, then you already have a good understanding of some things that will come up. It helps reinforce that, which is awesome, of course. I'm going to change things a little bit today. Instead of putting an individual audio click on it file on each side of the PowerPoint, what I'm going to do is just talk about it on this video. Then I'm going to put the PowerPoint that accompanies it on D2L so that you can flip through yourself and look at the slides as we talk. Prehistoric art, as the name implies, was made before there was a written history that we know of. So a lot of it is a great mystery to us, and there are many art historians that have different theories about things, and they will tell you that different things happen. There's a overall consensus that most people agree to that humans spent most of their history in what's called the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, right? So, as I say over and over again, that term lithos refers to stone, and then paleo means old, so it's Old Stone Age. We have in the Stone Age three specific periods that have been agreed upon by a lot of historians, which are the Paleolithic, which humans spent most of their history in, and then what signals an end to the Paleolithic or the Old Stone Age was the ending of the last ice age. So it was a time of great global climate change. What you hear people talk about is going on now, climate change. So this was a massive climate change. The Earth seemed to warm up. Much of the Earth and much of Europe that had been covered with ice, that landscape and geography changed as it warmed up. So we call that the Mesolithic or the Middle Stone Age, and then the next age to come is triggered by what we think were the origins of domesticated crops and animals. Agriculture signals the beginning of the Neolithic, which is the new Stone Age. Keep in mind that these ages can be confusing because they considered to happen in different places in different times. So what might be the Neolithic period in Europe might not be the same as the Neolithic period in the Americas or in other places in the world. So it can become confusing. Also, new information is being found all the time that challenges some of these ideas about history. So anyway, Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. Right? If we go to slide 2, it's just a map of the world, and some of the oldest human-made objects were found in Africa. We think that was the origin of modern humans as we know them today. And the theory is that people started being people in Africa, and then they moved out from there. We're going to look at some sites in different places, including in Australia and North America, and then we're going to look at some sites in Europe, and the cave art that we'll be talking about was in places like Altamira, Spain, and Lascaux, France. And then Stonehenge, which occurred during the Neolithic period, we think, in modern-day England. Slide 3 presents what might be one of the first found man-made pieces of art. Now keep in mind that we're making a distinction between what we call art and what we call useful items. So if you found a stone tool from however many thousands of years ago, that may or may not qualify as art fitting our artistic description, but something like this might. And this is from a cave in Africa, and this is a carved piece of ochre, and the carvings appear to be non-objective. They don't appear to represent represent a flower or a horse. These are non-objective marks that were purposefully made, and that might fall into that category of art. 75,000 BCE. By the way, when we're talking about these ancient times, the number starts off higher in BCE, before Common Era, and it counts down. So 75,000 BCE was, we go back 2,000 years to BCE, and then we go back 75,000 years, so it's 77,000 years ago is where this object comes to us from. In the next slide, we see some cave art from Chauvet Cave, which is in modern-day France. And the reason that this cave art is still around is because it was very carefully preserved by nature. Air damages artwork and other things, as does sunlight, as does water. So if something is kept safe from those elements, then it can stand the test of time. And these cave paintings thought to be from about 28,000 BCE. Those measurements are usually based on what's called carbon dating. So a sample is taken and it's tested to see how old it is. Sometimes carbon dating can be off by 1,000 years or so. And also it's possible that if it's an area where organic material entered at a later date, it can throw off the carbon dating. So it's not a perfect science, but we think right now this was from 28,000 BCE. The images that we look at mainly on these cave paintings in Europe, generally animals are depicted, and they're pretty naturalistic. They're very representational, and they're usually pretty good drawings that someone didn't just wake up and make one day. It was probably someone who practiced a lot, or someone who their job within that community was to create this artwork. People have an idea about the Paleolithic age, the Old Stone Age, of being a time of very primitive people and maybe cavemen walking around with clubs, but as we find out more about it, it seems that there was a society, there was a societal stratification, so people had different jobs and different specialties, and that includes people that had jobs as artists. The next slide, another example of cave art, and as you can see, this is two bulls, and if you look closely you can also see what look like deer that are smaller. All of this wasn't made at one time. There were successive generations of artists that helped create these. So one person might put an image on a wall, and then 1,000 years later someone could come and put another image over top of it. So it's really interesting for this group of people to maintain the same artistic conventions over so many thousands of years. When we start looking at art in the 20th century, we notice that there's a new ism, or there's a new change that happens yearly. So in the 20th century, we talk about all kinds of different art movements, but with these people, it seems to be a tradition that was stable over many, many generations. People did artwork the same way, and most likely for the same reason. Now, we speculate about that reason was. We don't know. There wasn't any writing that's ever been deciphered to tell us about what this artwork meant. We can only speculate. And most people think that it had something to do with spirituality. It had something to do maybe with ritualized magic. The idea that by creating these animals in the cave, you could somehow make the animal population stronger. Because keep in mind, with the hunter-gatherer society, the more animals you have, the more food you have, the more chances that you have to survive. So anything that could be done to create more food, even if it was magic, was very desirable. Again, we don't know exactly what these works were about. We're pretty sure it goes beyond just being decoration. People didn't take the time and effort to do this just because they wanted the cave to look nice. It most likely had a deeper reason to it. Next slide. Many of the animals that were depicted were pregnant. If you look at what looks like a cow here, the underbelly indicates that the animal is with child. Most of these paintings that we're looking at were done by pretty skilled artists, and they could very realistically represent what an animal looked like. So this was on purpose. This wasn't just an accidental distortion because someone didn't know how to draw. This is very deliberate. And again, it points to the idea that maybe by depicting the act of rebirth. Maybe they were somehow magically bringing that about or spiritually adding to that. There's a long history of images as power. So our contemporary idea is that I draw a picture just because I'm expressing something I'm feeling, or maybe I'm sad, so I'm going to draw a sad picture or whatever. Um, it's a much older idea that images actually have power, that to make an image of something in a way is going to make something happen or is going to help something to happen. So if I created an image of the Porterfield Hall with brand new windows and a new heating and cooling system, then maybe somehow that would magically help that to take place. And that's a pretty common idea in ancient civilizations. Not only images, but also words have power. So to write a word or to speak a word is a form of magic. It's a way to influence the future. And it's kind of fun to think about in your own everyday life how that might be important. Next slide, we're looking at carvings of what appears to be horse heads. And so we have three that are overlapping on top of each other. It was also pretty common for images like this to not just be on a flat surface, but this was on a outcropping of rock that came out. So in a way, by making animals like this, maybe you're helping to again bring those into reality. Another possibility of this is that it's possible that we're not looking at three different horses. We could be looking at the same horse in different times, in different stages of its life. That's kind of a sophisticated idea. It's a form of animation. It's art that involves time, so it's time-based, just like film or like photography. And of course, all of this taking place at what we consider a very early age in the Paleolithic. There's another example of what might be time-based art. We know that if we look at white-tailed deer in this area, they grow antlers at a certain time of year, and then they lose those antlers, and then the next season they grow back. So when we look at this successive image of animals that we have here, it's pretty possible that it is the same animal that's depicted at different times of year. So we have that time-based art again. Our contemporary view of time is that it's linear, that this day has a beginning point, which for me was, I guess, 6 o'clock this morning, and it'll have an end point when I go to bed, and then tomorrow we'll continue that linear flow of time. Other cultures saw time in a different way, so things that we see happen over and over, like the sunrise and the sunset, the seasons changing, that's not really linear, that becomes cyclical. And so time-based artwork like this, in a way, might be another attempt to influence that cycle or that circle of life. Here's another example of an animal that appears pregnant. Sometimes the species is referred to as Chinese horse because it looks like an ancient Chinese painting. But what we're looking at is an animal that's depicted that's going to give birth. Could be a form of magic. Along with the depictions of animals on the cave walls, there were some non-representational forms that, and if you remember back to chapter 1, non-representational art being not representing real objects in the outside world. So the square patterns that you're seeing appear to be non-objective. There's a possibility that it could be a depiction of a quilt or of a piece of cloth, but it doesn't really appear like that. It appears to be something else. We don't know what it is. Those marks have never been deciphered as representing any kind of concept or idea, so again, it becomes just speculation. There are very few depictions of people in the caves. We don't know why. It seems that people usually weren't the focus of art over this course of time when people were painting in these caves. One rare depiction of a person you see here, and as opposed to the animals that appear very naturalistic and realistically represented, the person is just kind of a stick figure. And it's a strange looking stick figure. It appears to have kind of a bird beak on its head. Um, Really odd. And it also appears to have an erect penis. And we can say penis because we're all adults. That's what it looks like. Um, really a strange kind of image to represent a person. Some of the techniques used for the cave painting we can observe still being done today. So if we look at an indigenous society like the Aborigines in Australia, we can observe the way that they traditionally make artwork, and we can theorize that perhaps the same methods were used in the Paleolithic period. Indigenous peoples, of course, shrinking population every year that goes by. Um, but the few that are still remain, we can try to learn from. So making those images consisted of an early form of airbrush, which you might put pigment or color material in a hollow tube and then blow it onto the wall using maybe a rough stencil, even like a human hand. Carving or chipping away from the rock, a subtractive process, can also be used to make images. Um, some of the carvings depict what we're going to refer to as petroglyphs or pictographs. So these could be a forerunner to language because it's kind of an abstract representation of people, places, or things. Um, and this probably leads to writing systems that are based on pictures like Egyptian hieroglyphs or the Chinese written language today, which is appears to have descended from pictographs. 10,000 years old in northwest Australia. Here are some examples of petroglyphs, and you can see like the abstracted or simplified figures, and it could be a way of telling a story or communicating a message. Also, in what's now the United States, we have ancient petroglyphs or pictographs depicting abstracted forms. In this case, what appears to be humans. Stay tuned for part two.